They made people talk. They brainwashed people. They used all kinds of drugs, all kinds of torture.
From shadowy Cold War safe houses and whispered rumors about brainwashing, few government stories have lingered in the American imagination quite like the CIA's experiments in behavior control. For decades, these programs sounded like the stuff of paranoid thrillers, secret injections, erased memories, strange interviews behind closed doors, and ordinary people being pulled into something they never agreed to. What makes the story so unsettling is that the paper trail kept growing. Newly declassified records do not show a tidy, limited effort. They show officials chasing ways to drug, confuse, pressure, and manipulate human beings in the name of intelligence. And since this story is all about secrecy and abuse of power, drop a comment and tell us what shocks you more, the experiments themselves or how long so much of it stayed hidden. Today, we're looking at how declassified CIA files reveal mind control experiments on American citizens. The blueprint.
So you brought up MKUltra.
Yes.
MKUltra was a government program run by the Central Intelligence Agency. Originally started as something called Bluebird in 1948-49, morphed into Artichoke, and then in 1952 became MKUltra. It was a mind control program, a brainwashing program. The CIA was trying to learn how to control people's behavior without their knowledge. Now,
the story begins before MKUltra became the name everyone remembers. In the early 50s, the CIA was already pursuing Project Artichoke, an operation focused on behavior control, interrogation, and psychological manipulation. Newly surfaced records describe a program that was not just curious about drugs, but actively interested in how chemicals could alter conduct, weaken resistance, and make people easier to influence. What makes Artichoke so disturbing is how broad the ideas were. Officials discussed substances that could be slipped into food, water, alcohol, or cigarettes. They also considered disguising these materials in seemingly routine medical treatments, including injections or vaccinations. That shows how far the thinking had moved beyond the interrogation room and into covert delivery. The files also make it clear that drugs were only one part of the search. Researchers looked at hypnosis, sensory deprivation, gases, and narco-hypnosis techniques. The goal was not merely to gather information. It was to gain control over perception, reaction, and behavior in ways that could be used secretly. Even at this early stage, the program had already outgrown the image of a few isolated tests. Artichoke was a framework. It helped lay the groundwork for later efforts, especially MKUltra, by turning wild theories about mind control into a bureaucratic project with meetings, memos, research priorities, and a search for more bodies to test. Medical ruse.
We could disable a whole city by putting a very small amount on a water supply. After all of these years of us, those of us who are involved in looking for this secret drug, this was the only thing that began to look for the first time like it might be something like that.
One of the grimmest details in the record is how these interrogations were sometimes staged to look like medical treatment. According to later testimony, some Artichoke sessions used barbiturates and sleep-inducing drugs in a controlled setting meant to make the target think there was a legitimate reason for being surrounded by doctors and injections. It was not about care. It was about creating a believable cover. That distinction mattered because officials were trying to answer a very specific question. How do you make someone more open, vulnerable, and suggestible without openly forcing them? The medical theater was part of that answer. It gave interrogators a way to lower suspicion while experimenting with chemical influence. Soon, even that setup was seen as too limited. The CIA wanted methods that were more covert than the Artichoke model. That push led toward the use of LSD and other substances in situations where no fake clinic was involved. In plain terms, they wanted techniques that could be used on people who had no idea what was happening to them. The documents and testimony also point toward testing linked to hospitals, treatment facilities, and institutions connected to universities. Gottlieb's answers were often slippery, but over time he conceded that extensive human experimentation on psychochemicals had taken place in hospitals and mental institutions. That matters because it shows the experiments were not confined to distant black sites. Parts of this machinery touched American institutions that looked respectable on the surface. Unwitting subjects.
And I was subjected to electroshock treatments, forced ingestion of urine, sensory deprivation, keeping me in small, isolated, claustrophobic spaces. And then I think it was the winter of 1967, I was implanted with a stimoceiver and electrodes, and I have a CAT scan to prove it, as well as photographs and a metal detector report.
The phrase that keeps haunting the story is unwitting subjects. Again and again, the record returns to the idea that the most useful test was one where the person being drugged had no awareness at all. That was not a side issue. It was central to how the program judged realism and usefulness. Sidney Gottlieb, the chemist most associated with these projects, later admitted that the lack of awareness on the part of someone being interrogated might have been the key thing. That single idea explains a lot. The CIA was not simply studying substances in a laboratory. It was trying to simulate real-world operations where manipulation worked best when the target never realized they had been altered. Some of the most chilling testimony involves cases where LSD was used not just to confuse a person, but to destroy that person's standing. In one described episode, a subject was given such a powerful dose that he suffered a severe paranoid reaction, was judged mentally ill by an unsuspecting psychiatrist, and was effectively discredited in the eyes of his peers. The purpose was not truth, it was collapse. These experiments were not only about extracting information, they were also about disorientation, reputational ruin, and the possible weaponization of mental breakdown. The idea that a drug could make someone appear unstable, unreliable, or insane was treated as operationally useful. Safehouse America.
There was continued pressure put upon anybody within the agency in connection with trying to explain or understand brainwashing. So we were charged with rather an elaborate attempt to try to find out chemical, psychological, any kind of means that people could use to influence the behavior of the people.
If the paperwork sounds abstract, the Safehouse operations made it brutally concrete. The CIA worked with federal narcotics agent George Hunter White, who ran apartments in New York and San Francisco where unwitting people were secretly dosed and observed. These places have since become infamous, but the testimony shows how casually they were discussed inside the system. Gottlieb described the arrangement as a liaison in which the CIA funded the properties and White used them for his own work, while the agency occasionally used them for its purposes. That sounds tidy on paper. In reality, it meant ordinary people could be pulled into experiments without consent, then watched for their reactions. The reporting from these safe houses was not scientific in any rigorous sense. Even Gottlieb later suggested that this corner of the project was not really treated as science. It was closer to a simulated operational test, an attempt to see what happened when drugs entered messy, real-life situations involving informants, acquaintances, and whoever else happened to be available. These were not only distant Cold War operations aimed at foreign enemies. American cities became testing grounds. Behind apartment doors, with the CIA buffered by cutouts and partner agencies, the government explored what covert drugging could do to unsuspecting human beings. Failures, death, and denial.
The best-known case is that of this man, Frank Olson, a chemist employed by the Army Chemical Corps, who in 1953 was slipped LSD unknowingly at a meeting with CIA officials. Shortly after that, Olson went into severe depression. He ended his life at this New York hotel by diving through a shaded closed window in his 10th floor room. Frank Olson was the first known fatality in the CIA's LSD program.
For all the secrecy and ambition, one thing stands out in the later testimony. Even the man at the center of the program admitted the results were wildly unreliable. Gottlieb said the agency had as many failures as successes with LSD and concluded that when everything was added up, it was probably not a high payoff program. That admission does not soften the story, it makes it worse. People were put at risk for something the agency itself came to doubt. The most haunting example is Frank Olson, the Army scientist who died days after unwitting participation in an LSD experiment arranged by Gottlieb. Olson's death became one of the defining symbols of this entire era because it brought together secrecy, human experimentation, and the refusal to level with the public. Even decades later, the case remains surrounded by unanswered questions. There's also the matter of destruction. In 1973, Richard Helms ordered the destruction of most MKUltra records, making it far harder for investigators to reconstruct what had happened. By the time Congress began digging seriously into the scandal, much of the evidence was already gone. That helps explain why so many later answers sounded fuzzy, selective, and evasive. Even so, the surviving records were enough to reveal the shape of the operation. They showed years of experimentation, the use of fronts and institutions, testing on unwitting people, and a mindset that treated human beings as material. The declassified files do not read like a tidy confession. They read like fragments from a system that kept pushing until exposure finally caught up with it. Now it's time to hear from you. What part of the story do you find most disturbing? Let us know in the comments section below.